Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here and delighted to be with a group that's half students, half public, half the general public. And I hope over lunch you'll talk about why you're here, because I'd like to tell you why I'm here today. And one of the reasons I'm here is because of you all. I had the pleasure of speaking on the campus of CU's campus a year and a half ago. And after I spoke on some of these themes, some of you came up to me. Some of you were Democrats, some of you were Republicans, some of you were Libertarians, some of you were Independents. You came up and said, you know, isn't there a different way? Isn't there another way? Do we have to become enemies of each other? You know, Democrat, Republicans sitting next to each other. Do we have to become enemies? Do we have to start doing what your generation does? Isn't there a different way? Isn't there a way of solving problems together? And I was so moved and so inspired by that it's one of the many things that made me say, maybe there's a shift. Maybe there's something happening in our culture, and this is a time to really create sort of a new model. So I want to thank you for your inspiration. And I've been on some other campuses, and I think you speak for a generation. Your generation, over 50% of you have refused to identify with the political party. So that's an incredibly powerful no. Now let's find out, where's the yes? What's the yes to? You know, what's the yes to? There were some riots recently on the University of Kentucky campus and the UConn campus. Even though they won, there were some riots on campus, and one of the newscasters who was covering it said, why are they rioting? They won. And this was by University of Kentucky was after they won, not after they lost in the finals. And one of the newscasters said, oh, there's a little bit too much booze on the campus, and young people want to be part of something epic. Well, let me tell you, if you want to be part of something epic, it's not about tearing down goalposts. It's not about seeing how much you can drink. It's about being part of history. And I think 2016 is a year when the downward slide in America that's happened in terms of our civic culture could be turned around. So the real invitation today to you and all of us here today is, how could we be part of a turnaround? And this is the bad news. I mean, I have the good news, and you guys represent the good news to me. But there's some bad news. And the bad news is that our culture has never been this polarized in all of its history. It's never been so unable to deal with any major problems or major issues. When is the last time you saw America take on a major issue and in a transpartisan, or if you want, bipartisan fashion, make progress on it and do something powerful that you could be proud of? When was the last time? You know, the moon was in the 60s. What's happened since? It's been zigging and zagging between the left and the right because we've been given a flawed political map. And the flawed political map says left turn, right turn. Take your choice. And they both are dead ends. Just look at some of the maps on the wall. Left turn, communism. Right turn, fascism. So what are the other roads that we can take? The left-right model that we're stuck with goes back to the French Revolution in 1789, when those who were for the king sat on the right, and those who were against the king sat on the left. There was an aisle in the middle. 220 years ago, long before moon travel, long before the NSA existed, long before iPads and iPhones, and we're still playing the left-right game, as if that's a mental model for the 21st century. So I'm delighted that the millennial generation has figured that out, and I think wisdom might flow upward a little bit, and the rest of us might say, what are some other models for doing that? Because that's a flawed map, a profoundly flawed map. And that red light, I call it the red light because I think of that oil light on the front of my dashboard that when you don't put oil in your car, you know, it turns red. Well, I was working with the US Congress in the 90s when it turned red. And the place fell apart. And they hired me and others to do a congressional retreat. And that was because the oil of Congress, which is trust and caring and decency and respect and willingness to work through differences, that was falling apart in the 90s. Totally falling apart. And I call that the red light. The red light went on, saying there's no more oil left in our political system in the 90s. Well, the red light's been on for 20 years. And last October, when the government shut down, and following that, the credit rating of the United States credit rating was lowered, that was a sign that we were starting to really, that the engine was starting to stall. It took 20 years, but it happened. So I think one of the reasons there's this upsurge now, this upsurge of awareness, is that the breakdown is so clear. In our work, we found after the government shutdown, we would travel around the country talking to people, and there was so many more people who knew, oh yeah, there's something has to change. Transpartisan, what's that? It's because when things fall apart, people are more open to new alternatives. Well, we're at that moment now. So the result of living in this partisanship has been that citizens are disempowered. Think about it. It is very disempowering to say, are you a lefty or a righty? That's extremely disempowering if you're a human being who actually thinks and feels and has original and creative ideas. Extremely disempowering. When I worked with Congress, there was a high-level Republican congressman who, when I said to him, you know, why don't you do X, Y, Z and change it in the Congress? He says, Mark, you don't understand. I don't have any power. And I'm going, what? A high-level, the Republicans, by the way, controlled the House of Representatives at the time. So you got a high-level Republican congressman saying, you don't understand, I don't have any power. Why? Because the speaker had the power. So there we get at the key, is that when the parties control, and you've got two choices about how to operate in a culture, you're not a free person anymore. So not only are you disempowered, you're unfree. You're not free to pick your own views, your own ideas, and then take them. The whole middle of the House of Representatives was and is disempowered. Where are they going to go? They've got to go to the left, they've got to go to the right. There's only two games in town. Is it better than having a king telling you what to do? Damn straight. But to have two doesn't really make it much better if you're still not free. We've got to find some way not only to empower the American citizen, but to free up our voices. I read something recently that said, not pro-choice, pro-voice. Let's be pro-voice. So, disempowered, unfree, and then the other consequence has been incredible distrust and mistrust. We see it all the time. In fact, we're illustrating it today. The Republican State Assembly is meeting in Coors, and the Democratic women of Boulder County are meeting at the Millennial Hotel. And we're right here in the middle. You know, a mixture of Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians, whatever we are. And that's, I think, what's missing in America now, is a meeting place for us to start being the United States of America again, for us to start being Americans, to remember what e pluribus unum means. You know, this is all in our DNA. It's all in our bodies, as we'll hear in some of the other talks in this series. It's embedded in our bodies, it's embedded in nature, it's embedded in our family life. It's already embedded in us. So it's not like we've got to discover a new model. We've got to remember and dig deeper to find the model within each of ourselves. So that's the bad news. That's the bad news. There's a stuck system, the oil's out, the government's not working, we can't solve problems. But there's also some good news. There's also some good news, and I think the best way to share the good news is to first tell you why, the perspective from which I see it. Because I started in the 1990s working in communities across America that were divided. And I was working for the Rockefeller Foundation, and my job was to bring Democrats and Republicans and independents together in communities to propose a common enterprise. And that common enterprise would then be sent to the Rockefeller Foundation. They'd say, Rockefeller, fund our common enterprise. Don't fund some left solution or right solution in our community. Fund a common enterprise. So that led to my writing a book called A House Divided, 6 Belief Systems Struggling for America's Soul. And I happened to give a talk on Capitol Hill, and some members of Congress happened to hear me speak, and they happened to be developing a retreat at that time because the place had fallen apart. And after some back and forth and being interviewed by a committee of 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, they hired me to design and facilitate the retreat. So I got this inside look, and that's when I realized, Mark, your political map is out of date. Because I went there from Boulder as somebody who grew up in the 60s, who had basically a liberal background, who tended to vote Democratic, and I thought, well, virtue and creativity and idealism occupies the left, and narrow-mindedness and bigotry and money-orientedness occupies the right. It was a typical biased view, you know. And I went there, and my first shock was at the Committee of 10, I liked some of the Republicans and respected them as much as I liked and respected the Democrats. And some of them were actually more collaborative and creative than the Democrats. And so virtue was spread across the spectrum, and creativity was spread across the spectrum in that committee, and willingness to collaborate was spread across the committee. So I thought, well, maybe this is an exceptional group. But then I worked with the rest of the Congress and found out, sure enough, you know, there are incredibly collaborative, problem-solving people on the left and right. They just don't have anywhere to go. There's no home for them. You want a home? For your right-wing attitudes or your left-wing attitudes, go to the Speaker or the Minority Leader's office. That's their job. Harness the votes and whip them into shape. But you want to think for yourself, you want to solve a problem, there's no office to go to. Now, one of the things the retreat proposed was an office of facilitation that could do some of what we're doing here today. Well, guess who made sure when we came back from the retreat that there was no office of facilitation? You guessed it, the Speaker of the House and the Minority Leader. Why? Because it would reduce party power. And that's a key to understanding the bad news. The 10th Amendment says rights not given to the federal government will be reserved for the states and the people. Rights not given to the federal government will be reserved for the states and the people. Do you have it? Do the states have it? Or do the two parties have it? Look closely. I encourage each of you to look closely and say, who controls the Federal Election Commission? Who controls who speaks or not speaks? Who controls who gets on the ballot or doesn't get on the ballot? It's not the states, and it's not the people. It's the two parties. Look into it. So the Congress experience led me to say, well, something is profoundly wrong, and that includes my map. My map's obsolete. I need a new map. And I was confused about it and continued to work into the first part of this millennium with Democrats and Republicans, and I facilitated a lot of retreats for them in various ways. And I met a woman named Dolores, who was a chief of staff in the Senate. And she came up to me at a West Virginia retreat center once when we were in the middle of a retreat getting these folks to learn dialogue and work together. She whispered in my ear, she said, Mark, we've been told to oppose all the other parties' legislation, and they've been told to oppose ours. She said, I don't think that's leadership. What are we going to do? And I said, Dolores, you know, that's the question. That's the question. And she helped me so much by realizing she felt disempowered, she felt unfree, and she felt trapped in a culture of distrust. And she wanted a way out. So Dolores, we're doing this work for you too. We're doing this work for you too. So as I started to get a sense, oh, there's a message that needs to get there, we need a third way, I thought, well, what are we going to do? So a colleague of mine named Don Beck, who's out of Dallas, and I wrote this document that used the word transpartisan. And because Don was from Dallas and happened to know Karl Rove and managed to get it to Bush and Rove. And we did that because Bush had made this, in 2000, made this beautiful statement. I'm a uniter, not a divider. If you looked at the paragraph, you'd now go, wow, that's a beautiful statement. Almost word for word what Bill Clinton said in '92 and Barack Obama said in 2008. It never happened. It never happened. And it's never going to happen without us. It's never going to happen without us because they're locked in this two-party system. 2004, I met with Hillary Clinton. We talked about her Senate race. I said, you know, what about running a different kind of race? Maybe go to some events that are Democrats, independents, and Republicans and demonstrate that you can talk to a room that's got all of those folks in it, instead of going to Democratic event, Democratic event, Democratic event, Democratic event. She said, very interesting, Mark. We were old friends. Very interesting. Let me look into it. Here's the name of my campaign manager. Talk to my campaign manager. So I talked to her campaign manager. The campaign manager said, very interesting idea, very interesting idea. And nothing ever happened. Why? Because Hillary knew she was going to get 2/3 of the vote in New York. And she did. She didn't have to do anything new. She didn't have to take any risks. She was going to get 2/3 of the vote. And polls show that when she was done running, those who loved her more. And those who hated her more. Typical partisan campaign. 2008, I was like many others in liberal towns like Boulder, excited to see a new president. Thought, okay, this president's going to solve our problems. Well, you know, the Republicans found out that 8 years of George Bush weren't going to solve all their problems. There was never a bigger national debt after 8 years of a president than there was in 2008 after George Bush. What's conservative about that? And now, after 6 years of Barack Obama, and we'll have 2 more, I've never seen such encroachments on civil liberties in any series of administrations in my life. If you'd said to me during the George Bush era, Mark, there's going to come a time when your emails and your correspondence is being spied on by the NSA, I go, yeah, well, you know, I can imagine that under George Bush. Well, it didn't happen under George Bush. It happened under Barack Obama. So at my age, I know electing the right person or the better person according to your preferences and opinions will not solve the problem. And you know it too, because you've seen enough of it, whether you're 20 or you're 75. You've seen enough to know that electing the right person and pulling the right lever one day every 2 years is not going to solve the problem. There has to be another way of changing our way of thinking, our way of acting, and our way of being. So I've got to be honest with you and say there was a period during the late 2000s, between 2008 and 2012, when I sort of gave up on this. I did a lot of work for the United Nations. I worked around the world in different countries. I had the privilege, I was asked to do a lot of work with parties in different countries and democracies that were struggling or after a war in a country. And in each of these countries where I worked, I noticed they're plagued with the same problem. Kenyans can't look after Kenya. They're divided against each other by tribe. Nepalis can't look after Nepal. They're divided against each other because of ethnicity and other reasons, and China pulling them in this direction, and India pulling them in that direction. I mean, every single country, Japan, Korea, every single country is having this problem. And for a while, I was kind of running away and saying, oh, I'll help other countries since America's hopeless. And basically, I'd go to these countries, and they'd say, please go home. You know, please go home. Your country needs help. Why aren't you doing this in Washington? We look to America for an image of what the next step in the evolution of democracy is. What's the next step? You know, help us find it, you know. And so I literally did come back 2010, 2012, and I started saying, what's stopping us here? And that's why the experiences I've had on the CU campus, the experiences I've had in different places around the country as I've spoken, I really feel there's something new happening. And for the first time since I did the congressional retreats in 1997, I feel really hopeful. I feel really hopeful that 2016 could be a turnaround year. And I say turnaround year because I've watched very closely the elections since '92 in particular. And I've watched them get worse and worse and worse. And you've probably heard the weather forecast for 2016, right? The worst, most vitriolic, most bitter election is predicted in 2016 than ever. More money will be spent with attack ads than ever. More billionaires will throw in their crap ads on both sides than ever. It's going to be ugly, they say. It's going to be bitter. It's going to be terrible. Well, is it? Is it really? Why? There's two ways of reacting to that. One way is, screw it, I'm going to be an entrepreneur and start a little startup and forget about politics. Or I'm going to drink a lot of booze. Or, you know, I'm going to go organic farm and make sure my vegetables are nice and organic and my kids are eating good organic food. You know, there's a lot of, that's right, it is. They're all good responses, all good responses. But if we run away from this challenge, 2016 will be what's predicted. Now, I think, and my colleagues think, there's another possibility. That other possibility is that we find a new map. And I'd like you to think about, what's the new map in your head? Are you still thinking, and I'm going to do it for your direction, you're still thinking left, center, right, there's some line, and you've got to pick your spot on some line and say, I'm left of center, or I'm right of center. Are you still thinking in terms of that silly line that we were taught and that newspapers and magazines still say, you know, the left of center congressman, or the Republican this, or the conservative that, or the progressive that, or the liberal this? Are you still thinking of this line and trying to stick yourself on it? Well, if so, let's have a new map. What's the new map look like? I'll tell you, when we've done this in settings around the country with all sorts of people and organizations representing millions of Americans, every time we do it, they break out of this single line, single dimension model, and they start creating vertical dimensions of some kind. High collaboration, low collaboration, left, right. Something that says there's more to us as human beings, there's more to us as Americans after 200 years of democracy than left, center, right. Well, what is it? So I'm inviting you today, now and for the rest of the day and for the rest of your life to ask, what's the new map? And what map do I want to carry around in my head? Because if we can create a new map, starting with ourselves and each other, we can create new roadways. We may call those roadways transpartisan. We may call those roadways innovative. We may call those roadways creative. We may call those roadways synergistic. We may call those roadways independent. I'm agnostic about the term. I like transpartisan because it says we're moving beyond transpartisanship. That's all we know right now, my friends. I can't tell you what the promised land looks like, but I can tell you it's beyond partisanship. I can tell you we'll never get a good healthcare system, we'll never get a positive response to climate change, we'll never get a good education system if it's left to the left-right game. You know that and I know that. It's not about solving problems when it's that old game. It's about exploiting problems. It's not about issues, it's about weapons. And it's about winning. We know that. We can feel it in our bodies. We know the difference in our families and our communities in that different energy between I want to dominate you and I want to win, or I want to work with you and figure this out. We all know that the difference in that energy. So I feel personally that part of the good news is that there are a lot of people in this country right now that are developing these new maps. On campuses and in cities around the country, we're in touch with a network of organizations. You've probably read about some of them. No Labels in Washington, living room conversations in San Francisco, a whole host of organizations that are basically saying, we have an idea about the new way. We have an idea about this new map. And what we're planning to do is bring all of them together in a process that builds towards 2016 so that America can say, yes, there's the left, and then there's the right, and then there's this series of possibilities that take us into a new terrain. I welcome you, and I want to invite you to be part of that process. I want to invite you to be part of that process because I believe that it's empowered, transpartisan citizens who turn this around. And I'm going to say the three things that I said before. It's just the opposite. We will feel empowered the more we are transpartisan. We will feel greater inner freedom the more we are transpartisan. And we will know we're building trust. We will know we're building trust. So there'll be a future moment when the Democratic women of Boulder County meet over there and the Republican State Assembly meets over there, and we'll invite them right here for lunch. That's the future of America. Thank you. Thank you.